Okay, so here is me, Tabitha Del Ponte. My last name is Italian, quite literally meaning Dal of the and Ponte bridge. I grew up with a huge appreciation for my last name and my Italian heritage. I will tell you why. Here is my house in Richland, New Jersey. Behind my house, there's a quarter-mile path through the woods that takes you to my grandparents' house. They have since passed, and my dad now rents it out. But when I was a kid, I would walk through the woods to my grandparents' house to visit. My grandmom, Gloria Del Ponte, drew me in with her stash of cookies, although I was never allowed more than 2. In their living room, they had a huge portrait of my grandfather, Pio Del Ponte, hanging on the wall. It is now in my living room along with my grandfather's piano. My grandfather had served in the army and was stationed in Germany. When he had time to travel, he visited Vigo Lomazzo, the town where my great-grandfather, Peter Del Ponte, was born. The portrait hanging in the living room was of my grandfather looking over the town from the top of a mountain with his binoculars. And being a young girl, I was most fascinated by the photo album my grandfather shared with me from his trip, with a picture of him standing in front of Del Ponte's castle. It was my dream since then as a kid I wanted to visit said castle one day. But growing up, I didn't think I ever would. I didn't think it was something that I or my family would ever be able to afford. Our summer vacations were either at the local campground or in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Italy was a dream far removed from my reality. So, fast forward to 2017, the year I graduated from high school. I had been working as a paintball referee, and so I told my dad and sister that I would be saving up and going to backpack Italy by myself for 2 months. We somehow compromised on 2 weeks and going together. When we drove up to Vigo Lomazzo, a small town surrounded by the Italian Alps, we found that most of the last names of the apartments and graveyards were Del Pontes. We met relatives who showed us photo albums of their relatives next to my grandfather, a man they remembered seeing walking through the town when they were kids. Your grandfather? We remember him, the man with the really big camera. Yes, that was him. We got to meet our distant relatives that we had previously not known, and I did in fact get to see Del Ponte's castle, which actually is called Castel Spine and only owned by a man with the last name Del Ponte. My dad is big into ancestry and has traced our family name back to the 1600s. My great-grandfather came to the U.S. in 1912, working on the railways in Manhattan until he moved to Buna with his wife Amelia Grossi and started a family in rural South Jersey, a family of farmers. My grandfather was a lively man who would play the piano and sing at social gatherings, as well as working on the farm and singing with the workers. My grandma was very proper, sometimes stern, but very sweet. My grandmother's family is from Bologna, known for tortellini. She would make handmade tortellini for our family every Christmas Eve, a tradition that me and my sister now carry on. My sister and I actually traveled to Bologna a second time now, having traveled to Italy this past summer for a private cooking class to fully master the art of rolling the perfect tortellini. That is my dad's side of the family. This is really the only photo that I have of everyone on my dad's side of the family together. On the left is my dad next to my mom, who's standing next to my sister. Down at the bottom is my grandmom and my grandpop, and over on the right-hand side is my dad's 2 sisters, Brenda and Doreen. They disassociated from my dad because they did not like my mom's side of the family, and I've really only ever met them at funerals or in passing at the grocery store. A story that my dad tells me about his childhood that I think is really interesting is when he graduated high school, my grandfather told him that he would pay for him to go to any colleges that he wanted to. My dad had worked as a carpenter his whole life since he was a young boy, and he decided to continue doing that as he really loves working outside. And to this day, even though he's 68 years old, he still works as a carpenter and absolutely loves it. He ended up building himself a house in the middle of the woods off the grid where him and my mom lived until they bought our current home. Back in the day, they bought it for $12,000 and my dad fixed it up. My parents originally met way back in the day at a bonfire of one of their friends' house. My mom at the time was in her teenage years and my dad was 10 years older in his late 20s. They couldn't get married in New Jersey, so they went down to Maryland and got married at a courthouse there when my mom was 17 years old. And this is where I will share my mom's side of the family. My mama and papa of Hungarian and English descent raised 7 children together. They had a somewhat abusive relationship, my mom overly jealous, not even letting my pup watch TV because of the female characters. I have heard that my pup was also physically abusive at times toward my mom. Their son David died at the age of 3 when his ball rolled into the street and he was hit by a tractor trailer. Their daughter Kimberly, who was very close with my mom and now the name of my older sister, died at the age of 17 in a car crash. My grandparents on my mom's side experienced a lot of hardship in their lives. My mom, having grown up extremely religious, never smoked a cigarette or took a sip of alcohol. My pup, on the other hand, was a chain smoker who lit up a cigarette while carrying his oxygen tank around. My Uncle Donnie and Uncle Richie fled to Georgia to start new lives. I never met Uncle Donnie, but I know that he works as a corrections officer. Uncle Richie started a family down in Georgia, developed an addiction to alcohol, and as his father, an abusive relationship with all 3 of his wives. He now lives in a trailer on the side of my mom's house. While he doesn't sound like a great character, I actually like him a lot. He tells me to stay away from the family, to get an education, work hard, and to make something better of myself. My Uncle Dominic disassociated from the family and picked up a job as a correctional officer, now married with 2 kids. Only recently have I had the chance to get to know him. My sister also works as a corrections officer, and we all met up at a work gathering in Atlantic City. I grew up visiting my Uncle Peter in jail. He was caught robbing an old lady at gunpoint, although my mom swears it wasn't him. He was always really excited to see me. Peter moved out to Pennsylvania and had 3 kids with a lady named BJ, Colby, Alyssa, and Drew. My mom raised them as Peter and BJ beat each other up and used drugs. I grew up with my cousins as they were very close in age. Colby swore up and down he would never turn out anything like his father, and yet he has also been in jail and also physically abused his girlfriends. He denied his son was ever his until a court case proved it. For a moment, he really tried to get himself together, but then decided the kid would be better off without him and let him go into foster care. Colby now deals drugs and lives with my mom. Drew and Alyssa have also fallen into drug addiction, although both of them seem to have turned their lives around to some extent now that they both have baby boys. And so, my parents. It is no surprise that my mom also struggled with drug addiction. Just like my pup, she smoked cigarettes with her oxygen tank, and just like my mom, she would only let my dad watch cartoons because he wasn't allowed to see a female on television. It is easy to paint a bad picture of my parents. My mom used to hide me in the back seat under blankets when she went on drug deals in Mizpah so that no one would see me. I remember when I was older, standing in front of her car so that she wouldn't leave to buy drugs. She got me out of the way somehow. I grew up surrounded by her friends who were all users and treated me like any other adult. I loved them as a kid, and as I got older, would stand outside of the front of my porch to block the entrance and tell them to get lost. But that paints a picture of my mom that is very much inaccurate. I wouldn't trade her for the world. My mom gave me everything I could have ever wanted. She was there for every sports meet, cheering me on the sidelines, "Go Tabby!" And she would brag to everyone who could listen about how proud of me she was. My mom was always there supporting me, and she worked her hardest to give me everything that she never had when she was a kid growing up. Not once did I ever feel unloved. She worked as a horse trainer for many years and later as a security guard and a pizza delivery driver. I learned from my mom to be kind. She always had a smile on her face and a personable personality. Like my mom, my dad also struggled with substance use, with alcoholism. My dad decided to stop drinking when I was really young. I only have faint memories of him drinking outside, burning wood in the bonfire. My dad has been going to Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous groups now for the past 20 to 30 some years. He really likes support groups and has taken me with him a few times. He also goes to Historic Society meetings and is at church every Sunday. My dad reads a lot of books, loves history, astronomy, and has a huge fascination with old buildings. My dad does a lot of farming over the summer on my grandmom's property, and this past year we decided to build a shed together. He has been with my mom since she was 17 when my sister Kimberly was born. She is 17 years older than me, and after my parents raised her, they decided they wanted to do it all over again. My sister grew up a lot different than me. I had the better life. My sister grew up with my parents arguing, which I remember to a certain extent when I was younger, mixing my parents' shampoos in an effort to make a love potion that would bring them together, and my mom taking me to a hotel every now and then when she swore they were getting a divorce. But my dad was largely absent from my sister's life. While they have restored the relationship, she still calls him Glenn instead of Dad. My sister was my biggest support growing up. She paid for me to do gymnastics, and when Dyfus took me in 5th grade, became my guardian along with her husband, Bobby. My dad, in an effort to force my mom into rehab, had called Dyfus. That backfired on him, and I spent a weekend with a foster family before moving into my sister's house for 3 years. I told the courts I refused to move home with my dad unless my mom could also be there. I didn't want them to close the case and forget about her. I had weekly visitations with both parents during that time. Living with my sister was like boot camp. She made me eat healthier, meaning I wasn't allowed to have a box of mac and cheese and hot dogs at 1 a.m., and she made me make up all the homework assignments that I didn't turn in the entire year. I spent hours and hours crying at the kitchen table after school until I eventually learned the habit of doing my homework and studying. Living with my sister, I miss the freedom that I used to have. My hometown has little to no traffic, and I would walk around or ride my bike for hours after school, hanging out with the other kids in the neighborhood. We would all meet up at the stop sign after school. So shortly after I began living at my sister's house, my cousins, Drew, Alyssa, and Colby, were also taken from my mom's house through DYFS. And my mom's house to this day is very unlivable. She's a hoarder, so there's trash and junk everywhere. She also doesn't have heat or running water. And so the kids were in the foster care system, and I had convinced my sister and Bobby to take them in. So Drew ended up staying at my sister's house all throughout high school and until she went to college. Colby stayed with my sister and Bobby for a year until they found out that he had sexually abused my cousin Drew, and so he went back into the foster care system. And Alyssa never ended up coming with us because she found a lady Barbara to stay with, although that didn't work out. And eventually she had to go into a group home along with Colby until my mama was able to get the house back to better conditions. Although I grew up really close with all of my cousins, this time that I was at my sister's house, I got really close with my cousin Drew. We were living in the same room together the whole time. Bobby paid for us all to go on a trip to Disney World together. But I would say my sister and Bobby, taking in my cousins and me at a really young age early in their marriage, it did put a lot of stress on their relationship, and they didn't really have time to have their own kids, and eventually they did get divorced. And unfortunately, Bobby kind of really fell off the rails after that. He got fired from his correctional officer job. He was a sergeant at the time, and he eventually started using drugs, and he passed away from an overdose last year. But I was able to speak at his funeral, and I just shared how much he had helped me growing up and how much of a huge support he was for me throughout middle school and high school. Bobby's mom, Robin, was like a second mom to me and my sister, especially after my mom had passed away. And even after Bobby and my sister got divorced, Robin was still very present in our lives. And when she was diagnosed with cancer, my sister took her on a trip to Hawaii, and she ended up passing away a month before Bobby's overdose. In 7th grade, I moved home with my parents. My sister was worried that I would let all of my grades drop, but I kept them up. I took all honors and AP classes in high school, and education transformed into my way out of the cycle of poverty and addiction that my family was accustomed to. My sister ingrained into me that I had to go to college and that I needed to break the cycle. While I was living at my sister's, my mom had been in and out of rehab. She was really excited to show me her keychain, clean for 90 days, and would not mention it at other times. I knew that she was fighting for me and that not once during those 3 years did my parents forget about me or not put every effort into getting me back. I also went to parenting classes with my mom every week, and it was really awesome for our relationship. While my mom and dad would say that they hate DYFS because it tore us apart, in many ways, it molded us back together in a better way. My mom's health started deteriorating around the time that I started high school. She was in and out of the hospital. My dad and I just thought that she wanted pain medication and didn't really take her seriously. Eventually, she couldn't walk far and she used a wheelchair. Some days she would be up and about like her normal self. Other days she would lay in bed all day barely awake. My mom would tell me she is going to get better so that she can play softball with me outside. I remember feeling mad at my mom. Mad that she wasn't in good enough health to practice with me. Mad that at one point in time, before I was even born, my mom decided to do drugs. I was mad that she didn't think of me in that moment. She didn't think that one day she would have a daughter she'd want to play softball with. My mom slept downstairs in the living room because she couldn't walk upstairs. She was yelling at me at the bottom of the steps to get ready for school, which was unusual because she normally couldn't walk that far. I noticed my mom's nebulizer treatment was running for longer than normal. When I went downstairs, she had fallen face first on the living room floor, lying unconscious. I ran outside to my cousin Colby, who had been sleeping in the back seat of my mom's car overnight. He snuck out of a foster group home in Atlantic City the night prior and took a bus to our house. My dad wouldn't let him inside because he was afraid that he might steal from us. Colby called the cops and the ambulance came. They said my mom went into cardiac arrest on the way there. She was unconscious on life support for a few days until she passed. That was my sophomore year of high school and undoubtedly the hardest year of my life. I wanted to hold on to my mom and didn't want to move forward with the world around me. This was the first time I experienced depression. My dad had to take on a new role and did the best he could to fill the void. Eventually, I found a place of acceptance and let go of the memories that I had been holding onto. I started to think more about what really mattered in life and focus more time on relationships and doing things that make me happy. After high school, I was sponsored to do a Rotary Youth Exchange year in Brazil. I lived with a host family, went back to high school, learned to dance, and met a lot of new friends. This experience really opened up my eyes to the world around me. Brazil doesn't have a large middle class like the United States, mostly the poor and the rich who live separately from each other. I remember my host family, after a long drive, stopped at a man's house and asked to use his bathroom. The man lived in a one-bedroom brick house that he made himself. The bathroom was outside, a bucket surrounded by wooden sticks for privacy. I ended up waiting until our destination, but it really put into perspective this term, privilege. While I grew up quote-unquote poor, had free lunch at school my whole life, I remember my dad warming up water on the wood stove to take a bath at one point when I was younger and we didn't have any hot water. I never had cable growing up and would watch old shows with my dad, sometimes even in black and white. To this day, I don't get a lot of people's movie references, and they wonder if I've lived under a rock my whole life. We didn't have the internet until later, and I had to use the computers at school to write my essays because our desktop computer at home rarely worked. I did most of the food shopping and would hide from anyone I knew from high school who worked at the checkout at ShopRite because I didn't want them to see I had a food stamps card. Or that when everyone at college went home over break, I stayed on campus because my house had so much clutter and dust I couldn't breathe in it. I could paint the picture of me being underprivileged. But I grew up with my cousins, Colby, Alyssa, and Drew, telling me that I was spoiled.
You have more than every single one of us, and you're still living better than every single one of us. But you don't see that, do you? No, you don't. We all envy you at the end of the day because you have everything we wanted. You have it all, and you barely had to do fucking shit for it. I don't care if you say you had to, whatever, what your struggle is, you lost your mom. I never had a mom, never had a dad. I didn't have none of that.
I had two loving parents. They did not. My parents bought me everything I needed and a lot of the things I wanted. My cousins didn't get anything. I played sports. My mom couldn't afford for them too. My dad saved up the money to pay for me to go to college, and when I graduated high school, gave me $10,000 that I later used to buy a car. This was the money that the government had given him every month after my mom passed away, and he didn't spend a dime of it. My cousins didn't have someone like my sister around to encourage them to graduate high school or to help them financially through life milestones. I certainly have privilege. I'm a white heterosexual female raised in an English-speaking country, a country that provided me with a great public education. In Brazil, only those that can afford to send their children to private schools can get a good education. There are kids in public schools who are illiterate, schools without textbooks. The man who invited us to use his bathroom lived in the middle of nowhere. He did not have a public education that would provide him with opportunities. There was no way out of his current situation, to which I do want to add may have been a comfortable one for him. In Brazil, it is also typical that every family has a maid to cook and clean. I bonded a lot with the maid at our house. She stressed to me that she may not have money, but she has the important things in life, and that is her friends and family, having a smile on her face, and giving people big hugs. I learned a lot from her. My host family also. They were extremely kind and loving. This was my first experience with a quote-unquote normal family. We would all meet together, uncles, aunts, grandparents, for lunch every single Sunday. When I would come home from school, I would sit with my host dad and host mom and two sisters, and we would all sing karaoke together as they played the guitar.
Será nuvem passageira, essa espera, esse penar, essa espera, esse penar, essa espera, esse penar. Ao longe vejo o trem que cabe na palma da mão.
They called me their daughter, not their American daughter, and I called them mom, dad, and sister. I always wished that I could have a big family. I never got to meet most of my dad's side of the family because they did not like my mom. We had to keep my mom's side of the family at a distance and eventually stopped inviting them over for holidays after the cops had to show up over consecutive years. I hope one day that I can have a big family of my own. While I am not close with my cousins, I hope that I can be the support for their children that my sister was for me. I hope that as a school counselor, I can be the encouragement to those students like my cousins who never had an adult figure rooting for them. Living in Brazil, this was also the first time that I had strongly questioned racism. Some of my best friends growing up had been black. Tamara and me would hang out every day after school. We would meet up with Darnell and Denzel and learn how to dance to Drill on That Beat, the lyrics to Fetty Wap, and they would encourage me to join in spitting bars, even though I was embarrassingly bad at it. They would make fun of me for being proper and only ever talking about school. One time, Darnell's mom braided my hair in cornrows. I remember going to school and everyone giving me weird looks, blacks and whites alike. I liked the hairstyle, but to some it came off as trying to be a culture that wasn't mine. Tamir would come on family vacations with my parents and was like a second sibling in our house. So I was allowed to have friends that weren't the same skin color as me and encouraged to treat everyone equally. Our primary care doctor is black, my parents had friends of color, and some even worked at the local deli my mom used to own. But the rule was that I could never date anyone outside of my race, and I just accepted that. Well, until I lived in Brazil for a year. I developed an even greater appreciation for cultural diversity and made personal friendships with people not only from Brazil, but also countries all over the world, such as Mexico, Thailand, Japan, France, Germany, Iceland, Czech Republic, and many more. I thought, my family would probably accept a white man who used drugs and physically abused me before they would accept an educated black man who treated me well. That was really when I realized how unfair that was. From that point on, I took a different stance for my family and decided that whenever I have children, I will teach them against racism. While living in Brazil, I also learned that this country, that the media depicted as unsafe and savage, had everyday people living in it that carried out normal lives. While my friends back home were telling me not to get abducted or robbed, my Uber driver in Brazil was asking me how I could live in America having the threat of terrorist attacks and school shootings. While in college, I tagged along on a trip to Egypt with some friends in the Arabic club. It turned out that they are just your everyday average people living their normal lives there too.
Hallo, alles gut?
A major for Egypt. He can tell them, sorry, if this country is not safe, you're not gonna walk at midnight to go to a cafe. You're not gonna be able to go to a wedding. I don't know even the people in the wedding, You're not gonna be really welcome, when you go to a local cafe and everybody, say welcome, have a seat. What would you like to drink? And everybody smile with you. If it's not safe, you know what I mean? So just please, if you don't mind, try to help us to tell everybody how is Egypt, because serious, nobody will know unless you hear from someone. Thank you very much. Don't cry now.
I really love traveling and learning about other cultures as well as studying languages, to the extent that in my free time I watch Geography Now videos on YouTube or take language classes on Preply. I currently speak fluent Portuguese and Spanish after having lived in Spain for a semester, and I can also carry a broken conversation in Italian. Learning the language of another country opens you up to experiencing and learning about another culture on a more personal level. Throughout college, I worked with a nonprofit, Literacy New Jersey, to teach immigrants in the Glassboro area to speak English. I met with a lady from Salvador every week and ran a few group classes. I remember how challenging it was at first being in another country without speaking the language, and how much I appreciated people who would be patient with me as I was learning. While I was at college, I started to become more aware of socioeconomic statuses. I knew that my upbringing was a little more chaotic than most, but a lot of people from Buna came from working, lower, and middle-class families. Some students came from wealthier families, but that wasn't the norm. My best friend in college comes from a more affluent background. Her parents worked very hard to be where they are. I learned not to look down on wealthy people for being greedy or having everything handed to them. My friend and her parents were both lovely people who cared a lot about others in their community. I met my boyfriend, Ethan, my senior year of college. He went to St. Augustine Prep, aka the Rich Boy High School in my hometown. His dad worked as a blueberry distributor, bringing in millions of dollars until their business shut down. Ethan went from going on all-inclusive resort vacations and 5-star dinner restaurants to living a middle-class lifestyle. His parents started arguing and drinking more after that, although they are still wonderful people and happily married. Ethan opened me up to a whole new lifestyle. I was used to only going out to eat on special occasions. Now we go out to eat whenever we don't feel like cooking, which tends to be pretty often. I also learned that there are pressures that the upper class may have that the lower class might not, and that upper class families can also be dysfunctional or have members struggling with addiction. My parents never pressured me to make a lot of money. My dad instilled in me to work hard and to save as much as I can, but there was never any pressure to be a millionaire, to own a nice car, or to impress anyone. My dad wears ripped, tar-stained clothes and work boots to most of the places that he goes. At least for my best friend and my boyfriend, there is a lot of pressure to make more money than their parents or to live up to the lifestyle that their parents were able to provide. When I first met my boyfriend, he was working consecutively 120 hours a week, 18 hours a day, back to back. He's since then cut down. But it is definitely interesting dating someone who grew up in a different socioeconomic class. I have a lot of appreciation for my background, how I was raised, and the opportunities that I had growing up. I always felt like the parent of my household as a kid and grew up a lot faster than most. I still had an awesome childhood, but was more aware of the world around me and its realities. I could see what didn't work out for people before me and made sure that I didn't make the same mistakes. I understand my privilege and how the opportunities that I was given helped me to be where I am today.